Welcome to Eternal Dread, where fear never sleeps. Tell us where you're watching from, and what time it is, because terror has no limits. If you're brave enough, share and comment, but beware, something might be watching you too. Now, turn off the lights, and let the dread begin. My father named me Laika because when I was born, my grandfather told him to treat me like a bad dog. To father, Laika was synonymous with dog. He used the name to remind me of my place in the hierarchy. Lesser, beneath, inferior, nothing but a dog. My father meant to humiliate and degrade me with such a name, but he honored me instead. You see, Laika was a stray dog from Moscow. On November 3rd, 1957, the Soviet Union put her on Sputnik 2 and launched her into space. She was the very first animal to orbit Earth. The Soviets knew how to put a rocket into space, but they didn't know how to bring it back. This made Laika's mission a death sentence. Shortly after reaching orbit, the interior of Sputnik 2 became catastrophically hot, far too hot for mammals to tolerate. Mere hours after launch, Laika died an agonizing death. She perished the same way she'd lived, lesser, beneath, inferior, abandoned, unloved, nothing but a dog. I spent many hours imagining her terror, pain, and loneliness. How would it feel, spending my last hours hurtling through divine darkness in a metal bucket? What must it be like to not understand what I was seeing, or why it was suddenly so loud and so hot? What must it be like to not understand why, after being plucked from cruel streets and dropped into a bustling world of kindness, I was now alone? Perhaps I would think I'd been a bad dog. Perhaps I'd think this was my punishment. Punishment is my mother tongue. I know what it was like to be punished for transgressions I cannot remember or understand. To be hurt so badly my heart rate triples, and my mind flies out the window and soars into the stars, retracing Laika's doomed flight while my husk squirms and weeps on the floor of a dirty house 68 miles below. Even so, I adapted to punishment. As I said, it eventually becomes a language. Given enough time, anyone can learn a language. What I could not adapt to was fear. As a child, I was afraid of everything. You see, in the deepest, most forgotten parts of the world, there are things that most people cannot believe and even fewer would understand. Old ways, old things, old truths, and old monsters. Monsters like my father and my grandfather. How can I describe this in a way you will believe? Maybe I can't. Maybe I shouldn't try. So instead, I will describe my grandfather. He was called Pavel. By the time I turned 9, he had gone through 6 bodies. By this, I mean he inhabited them, using a variant of blood magic perfected by my forebears across many centuries. He leapt from body to body. He was not a spirit. He had a corporeal body of his own, a twisted, monstrous thing covered in scars and hard, glittering skin. A body that could shrink to the size of a garden snake or expand to the size of a house. But for all its marvels, this body was weak. Sunlight burned its eyes and blistered its flesh. So it entered other bodies like a hand inside a puppet and wore them until they rotted away. I will never forget the sight of him, of many hymns, in different bodies as flesh degraded and fell away in wet, discolored strings. Or the way his eyes, hard, round yellow eyes, glinted deep within their stolen sockets. Grandfather preferred the bodies of men, but sometimes chose women or children. Once, he even wore the body of my mother. I was very young then, perhaps 3, and the sight of her familiar form standing before the fire sent me into such transports of joy that I bawled from sheer ecstasy. Then she turned around, and in her bruised sockets I saw my grandfather's eyes, flat, glittering yellow, like rotted gold. I reared back, screaming. My father, who had been stroking a pair of old baby shoes, looked at me with contempt so deep it scorched my heart. "Shut up, dog." I cringed. This was a mistake. His contempt exploded into disgust. He shot out of his chair and stomped upon me. Dirty, squirmy pain exploded across my abdomen. I hobbled away, whimpering, and hid under the stairs. I lay there alone for many hours. Eventually my mind left my body and soared into the sky, a reverse dive into a sea of stars. I drifted away, dreaming of diamond-colored constellations and red nebulae. At my side was a curly-tailed dog with a striped face. My namesake, Laika. When I woke, I felt her, furry and warm, chest rising and falling under my hand. I opened my eyes. For just an instant I saw her in the shadows. Then she shrank away, sinking into the ground. I tried to grab her, but the floor swallowed her. My fingers closed on cold, hard floorboards. I covered my eyes and wept. Several months later, grandfather within mother gave birth to a child. A baby boy with yellow eyes and my father's curly black hair. Mere minutes after the birth, father picked up the baby and took him outside. He returned an hour later, empty-handed. Spurred by horror, I immediately ran out into the night. The cold was brutal, at once invigorating and exhausting. I searched until I found the baby, whimpering weakly beside a snowdrift. He was still covered in birth blood. I named him Alexander and brought him home. When I walked in, father immediately slapped me. I reeled back as stars rocketed across my vision. Never, he hissed, contempt dripping from every syllable. Never disobey again. Give him to me now. He reached for Alexander, but grandfather stopped him. I looked up and swallowed a whimper. Grandfather stared back at me through my mother's rotting face. The mouth, puffy and discolored, with an oddly detached look, quirked into a smile. No, let the dog keep her pup. We have other concerns. They certainly did. They worked together, and they worked constantly. Father kidnapped victims, and grandfather used them. Whenever father brought a new victim to the cabin, grandfather used his hands, long, hideous things marked with scars and covered in strange, glittering flesh, to tear out the victim's tongue and crush their feet. Then he would wait until nightfall, because remember, sunlight burned grandfather's eyes and blistered his skin, and carry them to his chapel. His chapel was an ancient stone structure at the base of a wooded hill. Within the chapel were 3 red windows and 6 rough-hewn pews. At the end of each pew sat desiccated corpses, facing the altar like sentries. I hated grandfather's chapel. The very air weighed upon me whenever I entered, crushing my heart and poisoning my lungs. The worst part was the fear, electric and paralyzing, inescapable. Luckily, I was just a dog, and dogs do not spend much time inside chapels. But dogs hear screams, even screams from far away, echoing down forested mountains long into the night. Grandfather did not often leave his chapel, but when he did it was always in the wee hours of the morning. I know this because my father and I were required to hold vigil until he walked through our door. Whenever grandfather came back from his chapel, he looked human again. Smooth skin, wide smile, good proportions. Sometimes he looked a bit like father. Sometimes he looked like his victim. It was as incomprehensible to me as outer space would have been to Laika. The stream of grandfather's victims never ended. Vagrants, the elderly, the travelers, orphans fleeing violence. There were so many. So many. If it weren't for Alexander, I would have withered into nothing. He was more than a brother to me. For all intents and purposes, he was my son. Neither father nor grandfather cared for him. They didn't even feed or clothe him. I had to feed and dress him with what little I had. Despite my best efforts, he never learned to speak. That isn't to say he couldn't communicate. He could, with gestures and facial expressions and nonsense syllables, but language eluded him. But it was all right. He grew into a sweet, curious boy with freckles and long, delicate hands. Over time, his terrible yellow eyes mellowed into a clear, bright green. He was my life. He was my heart. But he wasn't enough. One night, as a little girl's screams came shrieking down the mountain from grandfather's chapel, I finally went to my father. I lay prostrate at his feet, which is how he taught me to approach him. The wooden floor was rough and painfully cold under my fingers. "Why, father? Why do you do this?" He sat in his chair, watching the fire. In his hands he held a pair of white baby shoes. "Because you're grandfather and I must live, little dog." "Will I have to do this to live?" "Yes." "Then I don't want to live." "I understand," he said. His grip tightened on the shoes. "But you don't have a choice." I choked back a sob and waited for the dismissal. I could not come to him without crawling, and I could not leave until he told me so. Instead, he said, "Stand up, Laika." Hearing my name was like being doused in ice water. He never used it. By that point, in fact, I'd almost forgotten I had a name. I said, "Stand up, Laika." It was a struggle to obey. Fear made my bones rubbery and my muscles weak. Father held out the baby shoes. "What do you see?" "Shoes." My voice quavered. "Old baby shoes." "Those shoes," father said, "belonged my sister, Alexandra. I loved her more than anything. More than life. More than my parents. More than your mother. More than you. She was my heart. I watched him. The firelight threw his face into relief, creating crevasses out of wrinkles. His curly black hair shifted like smoke, and his long, sharp nose looked strange and monstrous. Paralytic electricity swarmed my skin, so much like the chapel that I could have wept. On my 12th birthday, Father said, your grandfather boiled a pot of oil and called Alexander to him. She and I were going to pick wildflowers later, so she was dressed in her finest clothes, a blue dress and white shoes. These shoes. Father did not speak for a very long while. She was my heart, he finally repeated. When my heart broke, I broke. It made me like grandfather. Someday, I will be just like him. I will live forever. You will too. That night, I had a nightmare of a little girl with sunken yellow eyes melting into blisters as my mother's rotted body doused her with boiling oil. I woke screaming. Moonlight streamed through the window, drenching my room in celestial silver. My heart thumped so wildly that I could see my nightshirt moving. It wanted to escape. I wanted it to escape, because without it I would die, and when I was dead I could sail the stars with the other Laika. Small, warm hands touched my face. I turned, expecting Alexander. Instead I saw my nightmare. Great inflamed blisters bubbled and burst, sending rivulets of pus down her tiny, raw face. The skin around its mouth had burned away, leaving neat rows of milk teeth fully exposed. Burned scalp and dull bone glinted through black, curly hair. A blue dress clung to her body. Oil dripped from the hem, soaking my blanket. Don't cry, she whispered. Alexander stirred between us. Get out, I whispered. The girl's blistered chin quivered. But you made me come here. Please let me sleep. All right, I whispered because I did not know what else to say. The girl burrowed under my blanket. I watched, aghast, as she threw a bony, burnt arm across Alexander and drifted to sleep. That night, I did not sail the stars with Laika. Instead I sat awake, watching the apparition with mingled excitement and fear. Just before dawn, my door creaked open. I tried to shield the girl as my father stepped into the room. What is that? He asked sharply. Please, I whined. Please don't. The girl shifted and, incredibly, began to shrink. Her body flattened into nothing, leaving her dress crumpled on the floor. That sank away too, leaving the cold, empty floor in its wake. What was that? Father screamed. I saw it in my sleep. Her! Father roared. Her, not it. I saw her in my sleep, I stammered helplessly. When I woke, she was here. Sweat gleamed on Father's skin, reminding me of stars. Get dressed. You must see your grandfather immediately. I fell to my hands and knees and crawled to him. No, he said. Stand up. Bring the boy. Alexander wept angrily when I picked him up. I ignored him and followed Father into the dark forest. The full glory of early spring bathed the landscape. Pale beams of light shafted through the canopy, cutting the thick shadows with gold. Vermin crept through the undergrowth, and deer watched from a distance. The forest was always full of animals. Grandfather was no danger to the birds or beasts, after all. Soon the chapel came into view, an ancient little church with a black spire, red windows, and frost-encrusted stones. Father ushered us inside. The moment I crossed the threshold, my skin began to crawl. Dread and fear swept over me. Alexander burst into tears. Father shoved me toward the altar. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the sentry corpses twitching. Chests rose and fell in jagged, senseless rhythms. One especially tall corpse with long copper hair turned as I passed. I covered Alexander's eyes and stopped at the altar. Shadows thickened and writhed against the back wall. Back in the pews, bones clattered and dried joints creaked. Something blinked in the darkness behind the altar, great, flat eyes like golden moons, shining in the cold shadows. Grandfather, the dog, Grandfather intoned, and her pup. He snarled, a deep, bone-shaking rumble like that of a tiger. Teeth glinted in the shadows, a shining ivory arc wider than Father's entire head. Pavel, Father said urgently. She had a nightmare. When she woke, it followed her out of the dream. It came alive. I saw it. Oh, Grandfather murmured. Oh, our little dog has talent after all, said Father. All good and well, said Grandfather, if she loves her pup. Do you love your pup, dog? He reared up from the shadows, twisted and sinewy and utterly inhuman. Do you love him? Or do you feel obligated to him? I opened my mouth to answer. Instead, I burst into tears. Grandfather laughed, a low roar that shook dust from the rafters overhead. A weak bitch indeed. Our hope is in the boy, Mikhail. It was always in the boy. That is why we made him. Now go. Those great yellow eyes flicked to the pews. I do not like to tempt my sentries, not when they are hungry as they are. Fear and disbelief battled across Father's weathered face. Do you not understand what I've told you? She creates life from thoughts. A poor substitute for what we require. Leave Mikhail. But Grandfather rocketed out of the shadows, a rippling mass of glittering skin and malformed limbs, and knocked Father to the stones. The corpse sentries uttered a deep sigh and continued to twitch. Never, Grandfather snarled. Sunlight poured through the crimson windows, imbuing him strange hide with a red glow. He looked like the sky, a starry piece of outer space. Never defy me. I waited breathlessly for Grandfather's eyes to burst and his skin to sizzle. He was, after all, exposed to daylight, but it did not. Many moments later, Grandfather struck Father across the face and whipped back into the darkness. We left. Father did not speak again until the cottage came into sight. Then he grabbed me and dragged me off the path. Listen, he growled. Listen well. I can protect you from him. And he looked down at Alexander, eyes blazing with disgust. When the time comes, I can protect you from him too. But only if you help me. Why should I need protection? He's small and loves me as a mother. Do you remember the story of Alexandra? Father asked. I nodded. Your story is coming. Only Alexander will be me, and you will be Alexandra. My heart fell to the cold earth. I carefully pressed Alexander's head into my shoulder, shielding his face from Father. Listen, dog. When next you dream of my sister, his voice broke. He pulled away and ran his fingers through his hair. Tears shone in his eyes, which were huge and miserable over his quivering mouth. When she comes again, bring her to me. All right, Father. I had never seen him weep before. The sight was frightening and curiously thrilling. I will. Father nodded curtly, then left. I nearly followed, but thought better of it. Instead, I stayed in the forest with Alexander. As the morning brightened and birdsong swelled to a symphony, I set Alexander upon the narrow path. He ran forward, humming a tune of his own composition. Shadow and sunlight dappled his skin, turning him into a woodland sprite. The trees were in full bloom. Petals drifted down like snow, carpeting the earth in glistening white. Alexander pulled ahead. After a while, I couldn't hear or see him. He drifted away, slipping into the deep shadows. Panic overtook me. Alexander! Alexander! I rushed ahead, grimacing against the pain in my chest. My heart thumped wildly, so hard I could see my shirt move. It wanted to escape again. Alexander! He darted from between the trees. I halted, overcome with relief so powerful it took my breath away. Petals covered his head and shoulders. As I watched, one drifted down and settled on his nose. Wide green eyes glimmered above it, bright as the promise of spring. For the first time in my life, my heart was so full that I wept. That night, Alexandra came to me again, blistered flesh dripping down her face. Her eyes had melted away, leaving raw, swollen masses of flesh in her melted sockets. Remembering my instructions, I sat up. Father, I quavered. Alexandra reached for me blindly, ruined hands closing on shadows. Father! Father burst into my room, gasping. Alexandra! He shot forward, arms extended as if to sweep her up. She turned. Father froze. Alexandra tottered toward him. Mikhail, she whined. Mikhail, my eyes hurt. Father collapsed and covered his eyes as Alexandra approached. She left a trail of pus and oil, shining like a tiny river in the moonlight. Mikhail, my hands hurt. Father wheezed miserably. Mikhail, my skin is on fire and drips away. She stopped before him and crouched. Father whimpered and whined like a beaten dog, twisting away from her hands. She set her small hand on his cheek. Father squalled and writhed, but couldn't break away from her. Mikhail, she wept. You're just like him now. She jerked and began to shrink, to sink, disappearing into the floor. The moment her hand fell away, Father leapt to his feet and ran. After that, he did not ask to see Alexandra. This is good, because I did not see her in my dreams after that. I only saw Laika. I spent most nights drifting among the stars with that dear, doomed dog at my side. Imagined or not, the sights were glorious. Incomprehensibly beautiful star formations, planets, great multicolored expanses of celestial mists. Sometimes I woke, bleary and incoherent, and felt her fur against my skin. But by the time I opened my eyes, there was nothing. One winter morning, I woke very early. My stomach growled immediately, and no wonder. Father hadn't fed me for days. I'd fed Alexander with table scraps and tree bark. That, I decided, would change today. I crept into the kitchen. There wasn't much, there never was. But I scraped together what little I could, and turned around. My grandfather sat at the table, great golden eyes shimmering in his terrible face. "Little bitch, what have you done to your father? He no longer hunts. He no longer eats. He no longer obeys." I felt like I was back in his chapel, crushed by darkness, heavy with dread, on the verge of panic. "Your ability," said grandfather, "has not been seen on this earth for 1,000 years or more." Of course the ability wasn't of earth. I'd no doubt come across it while sailing through space and breathing stardust. It's just nightmares. No, you take the dark things of the world, the fear, the hate, the pain, and channel them into physical form. And that is just the beginning. You will be able to do anything. You will make bodies, permanent, perfect bodies for me, and for you. The relish in his voice made me sick. He said, "Our women have always been weak and talentless. I thought the same of you, little bitch." Tears pricked my eyes and my bones thrummed as if struggling to break through flesh and run away. But it was no use. Destiny had already bloomed between my grandfather and I, heavy and foul with the promise of despair. Grandfather whispered, "Listen closely, for you will only hear this once. I was wrong." He left. I ran to the window and watched him hurtle through the trees as sunrise threatened. Back to his chapel. I waited until the sun was up. Then I ran to my room, bundled Alexander in every bit of clothing I could find, and left. We followed the path for many miles. Our home was hours and hours from the nearest town. We wouldn't reach it until long past nightfall. I could only hope that grandfather wouldn't notice our absence until the following day. It wasn't an unlikely hope. Grandfather spent most of his time in the chapel. The second this thought crossed my mind, a glittering dark shape leapt out of the trees and knocked Alexander from my arms. I caught a blur of twisted limbs and nightmarish hands, of great yellow eyes like flattened moons. Alexander screamed as a torrent of blood splattered across the snow. It sank quickly, melting red canyons through the pristine white. Grandfather at me, narrow sides heaving. Then he leaned down and tore out Alexander's throat. I screamed. Birds took flight and mammals ran through the undergrowth. The piercing note echoed off the mountains. The pain within it should have ended the world, but there was no one to hear and no one to care. Grandfather grinned. Alexander's blood and sinews clung to his teeth. I broke. I felt it, the crushing weight of sorrow, the almost physical sensation of my spirit tearing and bleeding out into my guts. I fell to my knees and cradled Alexander's head for hours. My father finally found us around nightfall. He had a heel of bread and an oily chicken leg. He pressed them both into my hands, then left. I tore the bread into pieces and dropped them, one by one, into Alexander's mouth. When he did not wake, I burst into tears and hurled the chicken leg into the woods. The moon rose into the cruel, dark sky. Stars glimmered through the bare branches overhead, creating a breathtaking fractal pattern. I flopped down beside Alexander, pulling him to my body. He was cold, terribly cold. I held him anyway, keeping my eyes trained on the stars. My mind detached with great difficulty, like it was trapped in tar. Finally, it wrenched itself free and sailed upward, disappearing into a silvery sea of sky and stars, rocketing ever higher until I saw the earth spinning below. Lycus rocket zoomed past. I reached out and caught one of the metal bars near the nose. I could sense Laika within. Her terror vibrated through the craft and leached into my bloodstream. "It's all right," I said. "It's all right, Laika. I'm here. When you land, I will help you out and we will play together." Her fear diminished, and so did her pain. So did mine. Together we sailed the stars, looking upon the earth and marveling at the incomprehensible beauty around us. I woke cold, sore, and in more pain than I can describe. I sat up. Alexander's stiff body broke away from mine. I reached for him blindly. A thin scrim of ice covered his eyes. The wound in his throat was an open horror. one I couldn't look at for long. I drew my knees to my chin and wept. After a while, something warm bumped my hand. A wet nose touched my palm. I knew what I would see long before I opened my eyes. Laika's striped face and dear curly tail made me smile, even through my tears. Stars glimmered through her fur, gently pulsing pinpricks of light. "What is this?" Grandfather's voice echoed through the trees. Rage flowed through my blood, exquisitely corrosive. Hate, I learned then, is pleasurable. It is fury, and it is the basis of power. Grandfather erupted from the darkness, scaled skin shimmering like a river under the moon. "You waste your talent," he sneered, "on a mutt. Not even your own pup. No matter. I will correct you." Laika reared up and leapt, snout piercing one of Grandfather's flat moon eyes. He screamed and shook his head back and forth. Laika fell to the snow, twisting, and quickly righted herself. Then she bit his foot. Her teeth sank through that impenetrable, immortal hide like butter. Laika was not large enough or strong enough to kill him, but she tore holes in him the way a match scorches holes in paper. Soon Grandfather was on his knees, mere feet from Alexander's corpse. Laika came to me, panting, and collapsed in my lap. She bled from 1,000 wounds, some small, some undoubtedly mortal. "Good dog." My voice broke. I stroked her gently, willing those wounds to close. I was a monster. I'd used Laika just like the others had, calling her down on false pretenses, filling her with hope before throwing her into the void. "Good girl. Good girl." I looked up as Grandfather's good eye slid to my dead brother. Something dark bloomed there, a wicked, corrupted hope. He curled in on himself, twisted body shrinking to a withered husk, and slid down Alexander's throat. I screamed as Alexander's body twitched and juddered. Then he sat up, bones creaking and frozen sinews cracking. He smiled. His eyes shone like molten gold in a forge. Laika attacked again. Alexander's face curled into a snarl as she bit and tore his skin, exhibiting an energy at odds with her awful wounds. I watched, helpless and hopeless and hurting, wishing I could detach and fly into the stars once more. Except there would be nothing there for me now. I'd called Laika down from the stars and doomed her. The snow crunched behind me. I whirled around. Father stood there, watching me with contempt. In his hands was a sleek, gleaming shotgun. Relief and horror engulfed me. This was the end. My mind would detach, forever this time. The fear would finally end. Laika bit down on Grandfather within Alexander, who hit her. She whined, but held fast. Father stalked past me and cocked the gun. "No!" I screamed. "Don't hurt her! Don't hurt her!" Father pointed the gun at Alexander's head and fired. Blood and viscera and dark, glittering flesh exploded across the snow. Father fired again, then reloaded, and fired again and again. Alexander's head evaporated into red mist. Finally his body lurched, and Grandfather, small, bleeding, scaled Grandfather, slithered out of his throat. Laika caught and held him. Father pressed the barrel of the gun against his good eye and pulled the trigger as the sun broke over the mountains. Father stepped back. I reached for him, drunk on hope and gratitude, but he recoiled from me. In his weathered face, I saw despair and rage, and contempt. He kept his eyes trained on mine as he placed the gun in his mouth. "No!" I screamed. He pulled the trigger. Half his head evaporated, leaving a glistening mass like a fleshy geode. His body stumbled forward a step, then crumpled to the snow. It took a very long time for the sun to burn Grandfather down to dirty oil. Laika held on until the last scrap of skin melted. Then she stumbled to me and collapsed. I stroked her until her body shrank and sank into the ground, leaving nothing but a scattering of tiny, dim orbs, the stars I'd seen in her fur. I touched one. It was pleasantly hot. I gathered them up and slipped them into my pocket. I went to Alexander's body, ravaged beyond description, broken in ways that did not seem entirely real, and sat with him until nightfall. Then I stood and walked away, and life went on. At first, I brought them back from my nightmares, Alexander, Father, Grandfather, even Alexandra, but I quickly taught myself to starve and eventually kill my ability. It is not a good power. It is born of rage, despair, selfishness, and fear, and I cannot tolerate fear. Besides, dogs do not have such awful powers. It is good to be a dog, because they are not necromancers. They are not monsters. They are nothing more or less than the simplest and most loving of creatures. That is why I will always be Laika the dog. Walk alone in the woods when the entity came for me. It was beyond a blur. It was, for lack of a better term, absence of meaning. Where it hid, there were no trees. Where it crept closer, there was no grass. Through the arc it leapt at me, there was no breeze of motion. There was no air at all. As it struck, I felt the distinct sensation of claws puncturing me somewhere unseen, somewhere I'd never felt before. My hands and arms and legs and torso seemed fine, and I wasn't bleeding, but I knew I'd been injured somehow. As I fearfully ran back home, I could tell that I was less. I was vaguely tired, and it was hard to focus at times. The solution at that early stage was easy. A big cup of coffee helped me feel normal again. For a while, that subtle drain on my spirit became lost in the ebb and flow of caffeine in my system. You could say my life began that week, actually, because that was when I met March. She and I got along great, though to be honest, I'm pretty sure I fell in love with her over the phone before we even met. It was almost as if the strong emotions of that first week made the entity fight back. It was still with me, latched on to some invisible part of my being. The first few incidents were minor, and I hardly worried about them. The color of a neighbor's car changed from dark blue to black one morning, and I stared at it before shaking my head and shrugging off the difference. 2 days later, at work, a co-worker's name changed from Fred to Dan. I carefully asked around, but everyone said his name had always been Dan. I figured I had just been mistaken. Then, as ridiculous as this sounds, I was peeing in my bathroom at home when I suddenly found myself on a random street. I was still in my pajamas, pants down, and urinating, but now in full view of a dozen people at a bus stop. Horrified, I pulled up my clothes and ran before someone called the cops. I did manage to get home, but the experience forced me to admit that I was still in danger. The entity was doing something to me, and I didn't understand how to fight back. Mar showed up that evening, but she had her own key. "Hey," I asked her with confusion. "How'd you get a key?" She just laughed. "You're cute. Are you sure you're okay with this?" She opened a door and entered a room full of boxes. I know living together is a big step, especially when we've only been dating 3 months. Living together? I'd literally just met her the week before. Thing was, my mother had always called me a smart cookie for a reason. I knew when to shut my yap. Instead of causing a scene, I told her everything was fine, and then I went straight to my room and began investigating. My things were just as I had left them, with no sign of a 3-month gap in habitation, but I did find something out of the ordinary: the date. I shivered angrily as I processed the truth. The entity had eaten 3 months of my life. What the hell was I facing? What kind of creature could consume pieces of one's soul like that? I'd missed the most exciting part of a new relationship, and I would never understand any shared stories or in-jokes from that period. Something absurdly precious had been taken from me, and I was furious. That fury helped suppress the entity. I never imbibed alcohol. I drank coffee religiously. I checked the date every time I woke up. For 3 years, I managed to live each day while observing nothing more than minor alterations. A social fact here and there, someone's job, how many kids they had, that sort of thing, the layout of nearby streets, the time my favorite television show aired, that kind of thing. Always, those changes reminded me the creature still had its claws sunk into my spirit. Not once in 3 years did I ever let myself zone out. One day I grew careless. I let myself get really into the season finale of my favorite show. It was gripping, a fantastic story. Right at the height of the action, a young boy came up to my lounger and shook my arm. Surprised, I asked, "Who are you? How did you get in here?" He laughed and smiled brightly. "Silly daddy." My heart sank in my chest. I knew immediately what had happened. After a few masked questions, I discovered that he was 2 years old, and that he was my son. The agony and heartache filling my chest was nearly unbearable. Not only had I missed the birth of my son, I would never see or know the first years of his life. Mar and I had obviously gotten married and started a family in the time I'd lost, and I had no idea what joys or pains those years contained. It was snowing outside. Holding my sudden son in my lap, I sat and watched the flakes fall outside. What kind of life was this going to be if slips in concentration could cost me years? I had to get help. The church had no idea what to do. The priests didn't believe me, and told me I had a health issue rather than some sort of possession. The doctors didn't have any clue. Nothing showed up on all their scans and tests, but they happily took my money in return for nothing. By the time I ran out of options, I'd decided to tell March. There was no way to know what this all looked like from her side. What was I like when I wasn't there? Did I still take our son to school? Did I still do my job? Clearly I did, because she seemed to be none the wiser. But I still had a horrible feeling that something must have been missing in her life when I wasn't actually home inside my own head. But the night I set up a nice dinner in preparation, she arrived not by unlocking the front door, but by knocking on it. I answered, and found that she was in a nice dress. She was happily surprised by the settings on the table. A fancy dinner for a second date? I knew you were sweet on me. Thank the Lord I knew when to keep my mouth shut. If I'd gone on about being married and having a son, she might have run for the hills. Instead, I took her coat and sat down for our second date. Through carefully crafted questions, I managed to deduce the truth. This really was our second date. She saw relief and happiness in me, but interpreted that as dating jitters. I was just excited to realize that the entity wasn't necessarily eating whole portions of my life. The symptoms, as I was beginning to understand them, were more like the consequences of a shattered soul. The creature had wounded me, broken me into pieces. Perhaps I was to live my life out of order, but at least I would actually get to live it. And so it went for a few years, from my perspective. While minor changes in politics or geography would happen daily, major shifts in my mental location only happened every couple months. When I found myself in a new place and time in my life, I just shut up and listened, making sure to get the lay of the land before doing anything to avoid making mistakes. On the farthest flung leap yet, I met my 6-year-old grandson, and I asked him what he wanted to be when he grew up. He said, writer. I told him that was a fine idea. Then, I was back in month 2 of my relationship with Mar, and I had the best night with her on the riverfront. When I say the best, I mean the best. Knowing how special she would become to me, I asked her to move in. I got to live through what I'd missed the first go-around, and I came to understand that I was never mentally absent. I would always be there, eventually. When we were moving her boxes in, she stopped for a moment and said she marveled at my great love, as if I'd known her for a lifetime and never once doubted she was the one. That was the first time I'd truly laughed freely and wholeheartedly since the entity had wounded me. She was right about my love for her, but for exactly the reason she'd considered a silly romantic analogy. I had known her my whole life, and I'd come to terms with my situation and found peace with it. It wasn't so bad to have sneak peeks at all the best parts ahead. But of course I wouldn't be writing this if it hadn't gotten worse. The entity was still with me. It had not wounded me and departed like I'd wanted to believe. The closest I can describe my growing understanding was that the creature was burrowing deeper into my psyche, fracturing it into smaller pieces. Instead of months between major shifts, I began having only weeks. Once I noticed that trend, I feared my ultimate fate would be to jump between times in my life heartbeat by heartbeat, forever confused, forever lost. Only an instant in each time meant I would never be able to speak with anyone else, never be able to hold a conversation, never express or receive love. As the true depth of that fear came upon me, I sat in an older version of me and watched the snow falling outside. That was the one constant in my life. The weather didn't care who I was or what pains I had to face. Nature was always there. The falling snow was always like a little hook that kept me in a place. The pure emotional peace it brought was like a panacea on my mental wounds. And I'd never yet shifted while watching the pattern of falling white and thinking of the times I'd gone sledding or built a snow fort as a child. A teenager touched my arm. "Grandpa." He'd startled me out of my thoughts, so I was less careful than usual. "Who are you?" He half grinned, as if not sure whether I was joking. Handing me a stack of papers, he said, "It's my first attempt at a novel. Would you read it and tell me what you think?" Of course. Pursuing that dream of being a writer, I see." He burned bright red. "Trying to anyway." "All right. Run off. I'll read this right now." The words were blurry, and annoyed, I looked for glasses I probably had for reading. Being old was terrible, and I wanted to leap back into a younger year, but not before I read his book. I found my glasses in a sweater pocket and began leafing through. Mar puttered in and out of the living room, still beautiful, but I had to focus. I didn't know how much time I would have there. It seemed that we had relatives over. Was it Christmas? A pair of adults and a couple kids I didn't recognize tromped through the hallway, and I saw my son, now adult, walk by with his wife on the way out the door. As a group, the extended family began sledding outside. Finally, I finished reading the story, and I called out for my grandson. He rushed down the stairs and into the living room. "How was it?" "Well, it's terrible," I told him truthfully. "But it's terrible for all the right reasons. You're still a young man, so your characters behave like young people, but the structure of the story itself is very solid." I paused. I didn't expect it to turn out to be a horror story. He nodded. "It's a reflection of the times. Expectations for the future are dismal, not hopeful like they used to be." "You're far too young to be aware like that," I told him. An idea occurred to me. "If you're into horror, do you know anything about strange creatures?" "Sure. I read everything I can." "I love it." Warily, I scanned the entrances to the living room. Everyone was busy outside. For the first time, I opened up to someone in my life about what I was experiencing. In hushed tones, I told him about my fragmented consciousness. For a teenager, he took it well. "You're serious?" "Yes." He donned the determined look of a grown man accepting a quest. "I'll look into it, see what I can find out. You should start writing down everything you experience. Build some data. Maybe we can map your psychic wound." "Wow. Sounds like a plan." I was surprised. That made sense, and I hadn't expected him to have a serious response. "But how will I get all the notes in one place?" "Let's come up with somewhere for you to leave them," he said, frowning with thought. "Then I'll get them, and we can trace the path you're taking through your own life, see if there's a pattern." For the first time since the situation had gotten worse, I felt hope again. "How about under the stairs? Nobody ever goes under there." "Sure." He turned and left the living room. I peered after him. I heard him banging around near the stairs. Finally, he returned with a box, laid it on the carpet, and opened it to reveal a bursting stack of papers. He exclaimed, "Holy crap!" But of course, being a teenager, he didn't really say crap. Taken aback, I blinked rapidly, forgiving his cussing because of the shock. "Did I write those?" He looked up at me with wonder. "Yeah, or you will. You still have to write them and put them under the stairs after this." He gazed back down at the papers, then covered the box. "So you probably shouldn't see what they say. That could get weird." That much I understood. "Right." He gulped. "There are like 50 boxes under there, all filled up like this. Deciphering these will take a very long time." His tone dropped to deadly seriousness. "But I will save you, Grandpa, because I don't think anyone else can." Tears flowed down my cheeks then, and I couldn't help but sob once or twice. I hadn't realized how lonely I'd become in my shifting prison of awareness until I finally had someone who understood. "Thank you. Thank you so much." And then I was young again, and at work on a random Tuesday. Once the sadness and relief faded, anger and determination replaced them. After I finished my work, I grabbed some paper and began writing. While the weeks shifted around me, while those weeks became days, and then hours, I wrote every single spare moment about when and where I thought I was. I put them under the stairs out of order. My first box was actually the 30th, and my last box was the 1st. Once I had over 50 boxes written from my perspective, and once my shifting became a matter of minutes, I knew it was up to my grandson to take it from there. I put my head down and stopped looking. I couldn't stand the river of changing awareness any longer. Names and places and dates and jobs and colors and people were all wrong and different. I'd never been older. I sat watching the snow fall. A man of at least 30 that I vaguely recognized entered the room. "Come on, I think I finally figured it out." I was so frail that moving was painful. "Are you him? Are you my grandson?" "Yes." He took me to a room filled with strange equipment and sat me in a rubber chair facing a large mirror twice the height of a man. The pattern finally revealed itself. "How long have you worked on this?" I asked him aghast. "Tell me you didn't miss your life like I'm missing mine." His expression was both stone cold and furiously resolute. "It'll be worth it." He brought 2 thin metal rods close to my arm and then nodded at the mirror. "Look, this shock is carefully calibrated." The electric zap from his device was startling, but not painful. In the mirror, I saw a rapid arcing light silhouette appear above my head and shoulder. The electricity moved through the creature like a wave, briefly revealing the terrible nature of what was happening to me. A bulging leech-like mouth was wrapped around the back of my head, coming down to my eyebrows and touching each ear, and its slug-like body ran over my shoulder and into my very soul. It was a parasite, and it was feeding on my mind. My now-adult grandson held my hand as I took in the horror. After a moment, he asked, "Removing it is going to hurt very badly. Are you up for this?" Fearful, I asked, "Is Mar here?" His face softened. "No, not for a few years now." I could tell from his reaction what had happened, but I didn't want it to be true. "How?" "We have this conversation a lot," he responded. "Are you sure you want to know? It never makes you feel better." Tears brimmed in my eyes. "Then I don't care if it hurts or if I die. I don't want to stay in a time where she's not alive." He made a sympathetic noise of understanding, and then returned to his machines to hook several wires, diodes, and other bits of technology to my limbs and forehead. While he did so, he talked. "I've worked for 2 decades to figure this out, and I've had a ton of help from other researchers of the occult. This parasite doesn't technically exist in our plane. It's one of the lesser spawns of SZ, and it feeds on the plexus of mind, soul, and quantum consciousness/reality. When details like names and colors of objects changed, you weren't going crazy. The web of your existence was merely losing strands as the creature ate its way through you. I didn't fully understand. I looked up in confusion as he placed a circlet of electronics like a crown on my head in exact line with where the parasite's mouth had ringed me. "What's SZ?" He paused his work and grew pale. "I forgot that you wouldn't know. You're lucky, believe me." After a deep breath, he began moving again and placed his fingers near a few switches. "Ready? This is carefully tuned to make your nervous system extremely unappetizing to the parasite, but it's basically electroshock therapy." I could still see Mars smile. Even though she was dead, I'd just been with her moments ago. "Do it." The click of a switch echoed in my ears, and I almost laughed at how mild the electricity was. It didn't feel like anything, at least at first. Then, I saw the mirror shaking, and my body within that image convulsing. Oh, no. It did hurt. Nothing had ever been more painful. It was just so excruciating that my mind hadn't been able to immediately process it. As my vision shook and fire burned in every nerve in my body, I could see the reflected trembling light silhouette of the parasite on my head as it writhed in agony equal to mine. It had claws, 6-clawed lizard-like limbs under its leech-like body, and it cut into me in an attempt to stay latched on. The electricity made my memories flare. Mars' smile was foremost, lit brightly in front of a warm fire as the snow fell past the window behind her. The edges of that memory began lighting up, and I realized that my life was one continuous stretch of experience. It was only the awareness of it that had been fragmented by that feasting evil on my back. I'd never managed to be there for the birth of my son. I'd jumped around it a dozen times, but never actually lived it. For the first time, I got to hold Mars' hand and be there for her. No. That moment had shifted seamlessly into holding her hand as she lay in a hospital bed for a very different reason. Not this. God, why? It was so merciless to make me remember this. I broke down in tears as nurses rushed into the room. I didn't want to know. I didn't want to experience it. I'd seen all the good parts, but I hadn't wanted the worst part, the inevitable end that all would one day face. It wasn't worth it. It was tainted. All that joy was given back 10,000-fold as pain. The fire in my body and in my brain surged to sheer white torture, and I screamed. My scream faded into a surprised shout as the machines and electricity and chair faded away. Snow was no longer falling around my life. I was out in the woods on a bright summer day. Oh God! I turned to see the creature approaching me. It was the same absence of meaning, the same blank on reality. It crept forward just like before, but this time it hissed and turned away. I stood, astounded at being young again and freed from the parasite. My grandson had actually done it. He'd made me an unappetizing meal, so the predator of mind and soul had moved on in search of a different snack. I returned home in a daze, and while I was sitting there processing all that had happened, the phone rang. I looked at it in awe and sadness. I knew who it was. It was Marjorie, calling for the first time for some trivial reason she'd admit 30 years later was made up just to talk to me. but all I could see was her lying in that hospital bed dying. It was going to end in unspeakable pain and loneliness. I would become an old man, left to sit by myself in an empty house, his soulmate gone long before him. At the end of it all, the only thing I would have left, sitting and watching the falling snow. But now, thanks to my grandson, I would also have my memories. It would be a wild ride, no matter how it ended. On a sudden impulse, I picked up the phone. With a smile I asked, "Hey, who's this?" Even though I already knew. Author's note. Together, my grandfather and I did set out to write the tale of his life. Unfortunately, his Alzheimer's disease progressed rapidly, and we were never able to finish. He's still alive, but I imagine that, mentally, he is in a better place than the nursing home. I like to think he's back in his younger days, living life and being happy, because the reality is much colder. It's snowing today. He loves the snow. When I visited him, he didn't recognize me, but he did smile as he sat looking out the window. "Are we there yet?" my wife asked jokingly. I let out a light chuckle, but ignored her question. Despite my silence, she'd already noticed the faintest smile crack on my face, and immediately went on to tease me about it. "You see, things aren't that bad. We'd already been driving for 7 hours. A long journey to get away from the dread of daily life. Hotel Skjersilden was our destination, an idyllic place miles away from civilization, hidden in the mountains, surrounded by nothing but nature." "How do you even pronounce the name?" Alice asked. "No idea. I think it's Scandinavian or something. Don't know what it means, though." "Really? Then how did you even find it?" It was a good question, one I hadn't thought about since picking the brochure off my desk at home. It was just there, whether it had arrived with the mail, or if it had been handed to me by a stranger on the street, I didn't know. Just got the brochure. It was a good deal, was all I could respond. I stayed quiet for most of the drive, only uttering a few words of frustration as I attempted to navigate the desolate roads. Alice, being the wonderful person she was, kept the mood light. Throughout our entire relationship, I'd never seen her smile fade. "So, you ready to talk about what happened?" she asked. I shook my head. It had already been a year since it happened, and I'd found my place in uncomfortable denial. The holiday would be way to ignore the facts of real life, but I just couldn't bring myself to talk about it. "Can't we just enjoy this week out of town?" She nodded, and went back to pointing out the amazing environment around us. 5 hours later, we found ourselves traveling up a treacherous mountain road. Though decayed, it provided us a beautiful view of the valley beneath. Before long, the peak of Hotel Skjersilden greeted us, and I let out a sigh of relief. Its architecture was magnificent, starkly contrasting the lush trees around it. The design was old, but it remained amazingly well kept, a staple from times long since past. "Does the place at least match the pictures from your mysterious brochure?" she asked. I took a quick look over the beautiful structure and nodded. "It actually does." "Well, that's a good start." There were a few elderly people sitting out on the porch, enjoying cups of tea and smoking cigarettes. They were dressed elegantly in ballroom dresses and fancy suits, a bit odd for such a casual place. As I unloaded our car, I noticed that we'd only brought one massive bag. "Where are your things?" I asked. "Come on, I don't need anything," Alice chuckled. "Besides, it's an all-inclusive hotel." I scoffed as I struggled to get the luggage out. "You just put your stuff in my bags, didn't you?" By the entrance stood a large wooden sign that read, "Hotel Skjersilden, helping people rest since 1886. We entered through the front door, which led us to a large hall divided between reception and a restaurant. I glanced over at the well-stocked bar, and saw a couple of women enjoying exotic drinks clearly not native to the area. "Hello, I have a booking for Alex Henson," I told the man behind the reception desk. He was a well-dressed man in his early 50s. He wore a red uniform and a bow tie, and smiled wide. In a way, he didn't really fit in with the rustic design of the hotel, but he seemed friendly enough. "Mr. Henson, yes of course. My name is Elazer Winchester. Welcome to Hotel Skjersilden," he said as he pointed to a set of stairs. "Let me show you to your room. We've situated you with a beautiful view of the mountain range." As we walked, we passed a few tired-looking guests, just hanging aimlessly around in the hallways. They looked out of place, wearing clothes better fit for the last century. Most of them were elderly, but there were a few peculiar-looking young characters as well. One looked like he'd been taken straight out of Woodstock, and another could have been on the set of a 50s gangster movie. Mind if I ask you a question? Of course, Mr. Henson. I'm here to help. What's up with the costume people? Oh, don't worry about that. Some of our guests have been here for a while. At this point, we consider them more family than visitors. Excuse me? They're quite harmless, I assure you. Without really answering my questions, he guided us into our room. It was larger than expected and beautifully decorated, full on with a piece of chocolate laid out on our pillows. All things considered, it looked like the beginning of a perfect getaway. I quickly freshened myself up, using the hotel-provided accessories, and got ready for dinner. Aren't you going to unpack? Alice asked as I headed for the door. Nah, I'll do it later. We headed down to the bar and noticed Mr. Winchester standing by the entrance, waiting for guests. Would you like a table by the window? He asked with a smile. We nodded, and he led us to a table with a clear view of the magnificent forest. How about a drink? He asked. Alice looked over at me, and I knew exactly what she wanted to order. Maybe this is too presumptuous, but if you could get us a couple of caipirinhas? Alice asked. Absolutely, they'll be right up. My wife looked at me in amazement. Wow, wouldn't have expected them to actually know what it is. It was our private, favorite drink, a tradition we'd formed during our honeymoon in Brazil. Within a couple of minutes, they had been served, looking remarkably similar to the ones we'd been introduced to near Fernando de Noronha. Even the glasses themselves matched our memory to a T. We clinked glasses and reminisced about simpler times. Just the taste was enough to put us back in time. It's perfect. I haven't had one of those since. I trailed off. Something within me stopped me from completing the sentence, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Hey, look at that guy, Alice said as she bobbed her head in the direction of a middle-aged man, dressed in a cheap suit. He looked stressed, frantically sucking on a cigarette as he went through a pile of papers. The fumes from his smoking filled the restaurant, and quickly got on my nerves. Hey, could you not smoke inside? I asked as politely as possible, trying to mask my annoyance behind a friendly smile. Why, is it bothering you? Well, it's not exactly polite to smoke inside. It isn't? Since when? He asked as he quickly put it out. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to bother you. He went back to reading his files, and we continued our dinner. After a 3-course meal, we proceeded to get a couple of drinks at the bar. The man still sat at his table, mumbling something to himself, as he sipped on a glass of whiskey. He fumbled with an unlit cigarette, looking at it with longing eyes. I felt slightly guilty, having imposed my own rules on the man. If the hotel didn't have a policy against smoking inside, who was I to stop him? Slightly tipsy, I decided to engage with the stranger, while Alice went to freshen up. You can light it up, I told him. I don't mind, I just didn't realize the hotel was all right with it. He hesitated for a moment, before igniting it with a vintage lighter. Thanks. So what brings you folks around these parts? He asked. Just needed a break from real life, I responded. What about you? Well, the precinct decided I needed to take some time off to, well, recuperate. I glanced at the pile of papers that were pouring out of his folder. Looks like you're not exactly following orders, I joked. Well, murderers don't take time off, as far as I know. If I'm honest, I'm not exactly fond of the captain. If he wants me to keep away from the station, I will, but I'll be damned if I give this case up. Oh, you're a detective? He nodded. Yeah, for the past 25 years. What about you? I'm a journalist, I responded instinctively, before having to correct myself. Well, at least I used to be. He chuckled. As a detective, I guess I should thank you for quitting. I glanced at his file. It was stained with coffee and crumbled from being read one too many times. The case isn't related to this hotel? I asked, half joking, half serious. No, don't worry. I guess it's more personal at this point, not entirely professional, but... He sighed and closed his folder, sloppily shoving all the papers inside. But I can't get a grip on this tonight. Justice will have to wait. Enjoy your night. With that, he got up to leave. It wasn't until he'd left the lobby, before I noticed a piece of paper left behind. In his drunken state, he must have dropped one as he closed the folder. I picked it up, not intending to look at it, but at a glance I noticed the date, 7th of January 1978. It appeared the detective was working on a 40-year-old case. Confused, but keeping my nose out of trouble, I handed it in to the reception. Hopefully it would find its rightful owner. Slightly unsettled, we decided to call it a night. On our short journey to our room, we heard the faint sounds of a girl sobbing. With the dimly lit hallways and the echoing walls, it was hard to pinpoint the exact origin. "Do you hear that?" Alice asked. "Is someone crying?" "Yeah, we should check it out." Alice had a big heart, sometimes too kind for her own well-being. But her willingness to help anyone in times of need was part of why I loved her. We traversed the long hallways, and eventually found a young woman sitting in a chair by the windows. Her face was buried in her hands, and her clothes looked roughed up and soaking wet. "Hey, are you okay?" Alice asked comfortingly. She just kept sobbing. "What happened to you? Are you hurt?" "It's so cold," she sobbed in response. Her voice sounded off, as if her lungs were filled with fluid. I took my jacket off and tried handing it to her. In response, she finally lifted her head from her hands and looked at us. I almost fell to the ground in shock as I saw her horrifically disfigured face. At a first glance, it looked like someone had smashed it in with a hammer. Her eye socket had caved in, and her nose was broken beyond recognition. "Please, it's so cold." Despite her wounds, she didn't bleed. She just sat there and cried, barely able to breathe through her crushed chest. "Oh my God!" I shouted loudly in shock, an immediate sense of fear shooting through my body. Before we could properly react, Mr. Winchester came rushing down the hall with a couple of bellboys. "Mr. Winchester, we have to call an ambulance," I said. "Oh, that won't be necessary," he said matter-of-factly. He ordered the bellboys to carry the injured girl away and turned his attention towards us. "Why don't you come with me?" With that, he escorted us to his office. As we sat down, he poured us a drink. His smile had vanished, and he looked almost embarrassed at the whole situation. "I'm so terribly sorry you had to see that. We weren't expecting such a gruesome arrival tonight." "What do you mean expecting? What happened to her?" "Well, we don't know yet, Mr. Henson. But I can assure you, we're going to get her the help she needs, and figure out how she came to be in such a state." He seemed genuinely apologetic and concerned about the girl. Though unsettled, we couldn't exactly drive down the mountainous road in the middle of the night. Our best bet would be to wait it out, and maybe ask the detective for help when morning came. Despite the horrors we'd witnessed that evening, sleep came surprisingly easy, a silent, dreamless slumber, only interrupted by singing birds in the early morning. By then, my wife had already woken up and locked herself in the bathroom. She sang songs in the shower, trying her best to mimic lyrics she didn't know. It wasn't particularly beautiful, but I loved it nonetheless. While she got ready, I decided to take a stroll down to the lobby. I wanted to figure out what happened to the girl. Mr. Winchester stood behind the desk, smiling politely as always. "Good morning, Mr. Henson." "Morning. About last night, did you find out anything about the girl?" He nodded, still smiling. "Oh yes, she's fine. A bit shook up, naturally, but she's being dealt with." Before I got the chance to ask any more questions, I noticed the detective sitting down for breakfast. Thinking he could help, I decided to tell him about the situation. At the very least, he might be able to give me some insight. He waved as he noticed me, and gestured for me to sit down. "Thanks for handing in the paper yesterday. Whiskey and work ain't a good mix." "The name's Harold Finch," he said as he reached out to shake my hand. Really, the guys in the precinct would have had my balls in a twist if they'd found out. He was still holding onto the same folder from last night. On a piece of paper that stuck out, I noticed another date from 1978. Curiosity got the better of me, and I had to ask. "Sorry, but I noticed the date on the paper." "The date?" he asked, seemingly confused. "Yeah, the case is quite old. Mind me asking why it's so personal?" "Old? I mean, it's been in the works for a year by now, but it's by no means over." "But, it's from 1978, and that's only a few months ago. What's the big deal?" Speechless, I just stared at the clearly deluded man. I wanted to keep asking more, but my train of thought was quickly interrupted by Alice entering the restaurant. "There you are. Ready for breakfast?" she asked. I left the detective alone and told Alice what I'd found out. The weird guests, accompanied by the girl we'd found last night, had put us in an uncomfortable atmosphere. After a long discussion, we decided our best bet would be to cut the vacation short. While Alice wasn't exactly thrilled about the decision, she reluctantly agreed after I put all the cards on the table. Whatever was going on at Hotel Skjersilden, it had to be dangerous. Without notifying the reception, we packed our bags and prepared to leave. On our way out the door, I glanced over at the same elderly ladies from when we arrived, still sipping tea. One of them was bleeding profusely from her eyes, nose and ears, while another had turned pale as a sheet. Yet, they kept laughing and drinking, as if nothing had happened. I blinked, and they returned back to normal. Did you see that? I asked Alice. See what? Fearing I was about to lose my sanity, it didn't push it any further. Instead, I threw my luggage into the car and tried to start it up. Nothing. The engine simply refused to run. Confused, I popped open the hood of the car, only to realize that the insides had been completely ravaged beyond repair. It wasn't a simple cut cable, but absolute annihilation, as if someone without the faintest knowledge about cars had smashed it with a hammer. Nevertheless, they'd done the job, and we were stuck. Thinking someone at the hotel was the culprit, I decided to call the police. Of course, being miles away in the mountains, we didn't have a single bar of signal. Fuck, what the hell is going on here? I asked, frustrated and afraid. Hey, let's just ask the reception to call us a mechanic or something. I'm sure they have a landline we can borrow, Alice said calmly. I didn't trust them, but had been left with few other options. As always, Mr. Winchester manned the desk, and he seemed overly sympathetic at our conundrum. Surprisingly shocked at what had happened, he didn't hesitate to offer a helping hand. He let me borrow the phone, and I called for a ride out of there. Alas, due to the distance, they couldn't send anyone out for another day. I sighed as I hung up, but my disappointment was quickly replaced by shock. There, in the lobby, sat the injured girl from the night before. She wore the same clothes, but they were cleaned up, and her face didn't have a single scratch on it. Is that? Ah, yes, the poor girl from yesterday. She's fine now, Mr. Winchester said. But, she was smashed up, she was wounded. How could it dash? I stuttered incomprehensibly. I looked over at Alice, who seemed oddly nonchalant about it all. Should we talk to her? Alice asked. We walked over and sat down next to her. With her face buried in a book, she didn't even notice our presence. Hey, I said softly. Oh, it's you, she said with a half-smile. I'm sorry about yesterday. I wasn't really myself. I don't understand. What happened to you? How did you recover so fast? She pondered for a moment, as if to remember what had happened. The frightened girl we'd met last night had vanished, replaced by someone at peace with the world. Well, I don't remember exactly what happened. I think I was driving by the ocean, making my way back home after traveling the state. Then, I saw an animal just standing in the road, a dog or something. I tried to swerve around it, but I somehow lost control. The car went off the road, and I landed in the water. It was so cold, and the car was sinking so fast. I couldn't even think. How did you get out? I asked. She thought about the question, trying her best to figure out an appropriate answer. I guess I didn't. But if you didn't make it out, how are you here? Because Before she could finish her sentence, we were interrupted by Mr. Winchester. Mr. Henson, may I have a word? He asked, as polite as ever. He pulled me to the side and gave me a stern look. Don't you think she's been through enough in the past 24 hours? Let's give the poor girl some space so she can come to terms with her fate. What do you mean? Come to terms with what? You mean you haven't figured it out yet? Look around you, Mr. Henson. Tell me what you see. With these words, it felt as if a thin veil had been lifted from my eyes. I looked over at the girl, and her injuries were back. Despite her smashed-in face, her broken ribs and arm, she sat calmly and read a book. I looked at another guest, dressed in a fancy, striped suit. He had a bullet hole in his head. Then I glanced into the restaurant where the detective sat, still reading his ancient file. His jacket was soaking wet, dripping with blood. Yet, he didn't seem to notice. I shook my head in despair, closing my eyes tightly. Once I opened them once more, everyone looked fine. They looked perfectly healthy, all of them, but I'd seen the truth. They're dead. They are indeed, but you don't have to say it so loud, Mr. Winchester whispered. And you? No. I'm not dead. I'm something different entirely, but that's not important right now. What matters is the fact that you're the first living person we've had here since, well, ever. I just stood there, speechless. I half awaited a terrible punchline, but deep inside, I knew he was telling me the truth. Everyone at the hotel had died at various points in time, but why they were trapped there, I didn't know. The only question is, will you help us? Winchester asked. Help you how? The people here, they're all stuck because they are yet to accept their own demise. For some, it's instant, but for others, it's a rough process. All we can do is keep them comfortable here at the hotel. I'd help them all myself, but I'm bound by certain rules. What I mean to say is that I can't contact the outside living world. You, however, you're an anomaly. 1,000 thoughts ran through my head. Of course, I wanted to help, but a part of me still struggled to believe or comprehend the situation that was unfolding around me. After an uncomfortably long silence, all I could ask was, how? Just talk to them, you'll figure it out. So that's what I did. I started off with the detective. I knew that whatever answers I needed would be locked away inside that folder. I couldn't straight out ask for them, so I had to resort to a more crude method. I offered him a glass of whiskey and engaged in small talk. Once he'd finished his drink, I offered him another, and another, and another. Before long, he started talking of his own volition, and as he excused himself to the bathroom, I took a peek at the files. He was chasing down leads to capture a serial killer by the name of Lawrence Harrison. He was wanted for a string of murders occurring between 1975 and 1978, one of whom appeared to be the detective's partner. Using the landline, I called back home to request any news article about the case to be sent my way. It was an easy enough task with the connections I still had, left over from my old job. Mr. Winchester, how come I can't use my mobile phone? Rules, Mr. Henson. You're in a different world now. The landline is the only exception. That's how we managed to procure you for this mission. Procure me? Not just anyone can stumble upon this place. We have a few operatives out there in the real world, always working in subtle ways. Using as little as a simple brochure, they were able to nudge you in our direction. Why me? I asked. His smile vanished for a moment. That's for you to discover. Following the quick call, it was a simple task. All I had to do was to show the detective that his never-ending case had been solved. So he's dead? The detective asked. I nodded. Locked up in December 1978, dead in prison by 1980. According to the news, it was a detective by name of Harold Finch that broke the case. Unfortunately, he didn't live to see the bastard face his day in court. 1980, but that's, he trailed off. I could see the realization hit him. His once stressed posture finally relaxed, and he just smiled. I think I'll check out now. Next was the girl. I let Alice speak to her, using a more gentle touch. As it turned out, she'd fled home at the age of 15, and had since regretted her decision. She was on her way home to see her parents for the first time in 5 years, when her car went off the road. Though the head injury didn't kill her, she was too disoriented and hurt to get out. She drowned in the car, with no one there to save her. All she wanted us to do was to send a message. I never should have left home, she said. We all have to make our decisions, but your parents don't blame you for what happened. They love you, and they always will, Alice said. They talked for a while. Once done, the girl agreed to check out of the hotel and move on. There were still plenty of guests to go around. Alice and I made a great team, but to best aid their passing, we needed to ask Mr. Winchester for help. Do you have any advice on how to proceed? I guess you know the guests better than us, I asked. He nodded. My advice is simply that you accept the truth, Mr. Henson. What? He just looked at me, a hint of pity in his eyes. It's time, Alex, he said. No, I can't, I trailed off. I knew he was right. It was an undeniable truth I'd been denying for the past year. I looked over at Alice, her figure emaciated beyond belief, broken from the cancer that had killed her only a year ago. Please, I begged. I think you two should talk, Mr. Winchester said. We returned to our room, neither of us speaking a single word on the way. You've held on long enough, it's time to let me go, Alice said. I don't know what to do without you. We had a great few years together, but I don't want you to stop living just because I'm gone. But, you're not gone. It has been a year since. I trailed off. I just don't understand why you're still here. We didn't exactly have any unfinished business. She shrugged. Just because I'm dead, it doesn't make me an expert on the matter. But, There's something anchoring me to you, just like this place keeps its occupants happy while they search for answers. So you could just stay with me? She shook her head. Why not? She smiled. Because I already had a great life with you. It was the simple truth I'd failed to accept. Despite our time together being unfairly short, it had been one filled with happiness. In a way, I guess this place needed me to help you accept what you truly are, she said. And what's that? You're special, Alex. I know you don't understand what that means yet, but in time you will. This is where you belong, helping these people move on to the next chapter of their journey. We'll see each other again? I asked. Once your time comes, yes, she responded with a smile. Hours passed, and we went over each and every experience we'd shared. I held her, and she kissed me. I'm sorry about the car. I just needed you to stay, she said. That was you. She nodded. Before long, we fell asleep in each other's arms, and that was it. I hadn't yet come to terms with her death, but I'd accepted it as a fact. When I awoke, she was gone. There was nothing unsaid, nor any love held back between us. She'd only lingered on to help me move on. All she'd left behind was a note. Help them see the light. The decision had already been made. With the loss of my soulmate, I'd been given a new purpose in life. That following morning, I got dressed and entered the lobby. Mr. Winchester smiled as he saw me approach the reception desk alone. He didn't have to say anything. I already knew what he would ask. He gave me one last chance to contact friends and family on the outside world, who will be uploading this story on my behalf. Once it was done, he asked me one final question.